So as an epidemiologist, I've always been interested in epidemics. And the one that has interested me a lot is the Spanish flu of 1918, or the influenza outbreak of 1918. And when the coronavirus started coming out, I was asked to give a talk on the flu outbreak of 1918 and the coronavirus. And it was interesting to look at the similarities and the differences. The first thing I did is I went back and pulled out some of the historical photos from the 1918 epidemic, and things like emergency personnel, and then what's being done at that time in Wuhan about the coronavirus. And then I also pulled out things with healthcare workers, or how they managed the patients, the beds, and also the sanitation workers. And I think it's really interesting to see how those compare 100 years later. If you look at the pattern for the influenza outbreak, you see 3 distinct waves of the disease. The first wave occurred in the spring of 1918 in Fort Riley, Kansas. And if you remember your American history, that was World War I, and that was with military recruits, and about 100 cases, 100 GIs came down with this disease in a day. The next day it was 500. And it eventually kind of petered out in the spring and went down to minimal cases during the summer. And then there was a second wave of cases in the fall of 1918. That's where the majority of the deaths occurred. About a third of the world's population was affected by this epidemic in 1918. And about 50 million deaths occurred worldwide. There were 675,000 deaths in the United States. It's probably one of the worst epidemics. And when you look at the history of it and what's been done about it, one of the things that's amazing is how people forget about it. Like it was never mentioned. Once it ended, everyone just sort of ignored it and put it out of their conscious memory. The fatality rate of the flu of 1918 was about 2%. Which is about what it is for this coronavirus. The coronavirus may actually be a little bit higher than that. It's not quite sure yet. The reason the flu of 1918 was so bad was that that virus, we know now that it was a virus. Back then, they didn't know what a virus was, but no one had ever seen that disease before. So there was no immunity. None of the population was immune to it. Also, there were no vaccines back then for the flu. So the only real way to control it was through isolation or quarantining people, good hygiene, washing your hands, doing everything that we're being told to do now. And the other important thing was the best way to handle these are to prohibit or limit public gatherings. And that didn't occur in 1918 because, again, it was the war. So people were going to the bond parades and going into the draft or the sign-up thing. They were getting put on ships, being sent to Europe, being in ditches with other people. So there was a lot of very close contact. And I think that probably is one of the reasons why that epidemic was so bad, was that they couldn't implement a lot of these public health strategies that we know are important and that they knew, but they couldn't. The country was in the middle of a war. If you look at the influenza milestones, what you see is that in 1917, the life expectancy is about 54 for women and 48 for men. And during that influenza epidemic, it did affect the young people more. So the 20 and 30-year-olds were the ones that died during that epidemic, which is different from the current coronavirus. The life expectancy actually dropped 12 years during that epidemic, so that, it had dropped significantly by the end. In 1919, the final wave occurred. And then it sort of hung around for about 38 years until the 1950s. In the 1950s, the H2N2 virus ends up taking over. That influenza of 1918 is later found out to be caused by H1N1. In the 1950s, H2N2 takes over as the more common one. Again, this is a new virus. No one is familiar with it. It causes a pandemic. In 1960, the Public Health Service starts recommending people at high risk get vaccinated for influenza. And then in 1968, we come up with the H3N2 virus, flu virus, and then that triggers a pandemic. Again, no one has seen this virus, so no one has any immunity to it. One of the interesting things I find is that when I first started teaching epidemiology and we talk about this epidemic, no one knew what caused it at that time. And then in the late 1990s, people realized that they could isolate the virus or bacteria or whatever it was because they identified places in the far north where they knew people had died, like in the permafrost, and the CDC actually went up and took out samples of the lungs of these people who had died in 1918, brought them back to Atlanta, where they then isolated the virus and sequenced it and realized it's an H1N1. Okay, so H1N1 sort of disappears in 1950. They realized that the Spanish flu or the flu of 1918 was caused by H1N1. And then in 2008, they start seeing more cases of H1N1 popping up. And they realize this is going to be a problem. Because if it's anything like it was in 1918 with this population that doesn't have any immunity, then you don't want a repeat of 1918. So they had the vaccine, they had the sequences, so they started mass producing the vaccine and really were able to curb that outcome. If you look at South Dakota, every week they put out an influenza report during flu season. And you can see the graphs, and like this year, you can tell there was a lot of cases. Mm-hmm. And it came kind of earlier than most years. And then they can tell you also on the website for the Department of Health what the different types of flu are for that year, along with what we call the case fatality rate, or what percent of the cases, people that actually come down with the disease, die from the disease. And if you look at that data, what you find is that in 2009, when H1N1 came back again, and not very many people got influenza that year, partly because there was such a huge effort to vaccinate the population. I mean, everybody geared up. Now, the case fatality rate for flu does bounce around quite a bit depending upon the virus. And one virus, an H2N2 one year may have a higher mortality rate than H2N2 the other year, just depending upon who's getting it. Mm-hmm. But this year, the fatality rate for this flu season is 0.1%, so very low. A lot of people in South Dakota got it, about 12,000 people. Now, you've heard on the news or on social media, people are saying that this is just like the common cold, because coronaviruses do cause the common cold. So that's the main cause. The human coronavirus, usually the ones that cause the common cold are limited to the upper respiratory tract. So these other ones that go to the lower respiratory tract, like SARS, MERS, and now SARS-2, which is the virus that causes this COVID-19, those affect the lower respiratory tract. And if you look at the mortality rate for those three viruses, they differ widely. So for SARS, you have about a 10% mortality. And MERS, you have about a 30 to 35% mortality. The thing with SARS and these viruses that is important to realize is they do not typically, they're originally in animals. and they don't usually transmit from person to person. So in the case of SARS, that virus was found to transfer from person to person. So that's when you start having problems because you can spread it, right? You don't need the animal source. MERS, that has the high mortality rate, is in animals and it transfers from animals to humans, but there's no human-to-human transfer. So there aren't a lot of cases of it and there aren't a lot of deaths. This particular virus, the SARS-2 with the COVID-19, it transfers very easily from person to person. And it sticks around in the environment, on the desktop or whatever, for quite a bit of time. So it's highly infectious. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that's pretty scary about it. The mortality rate is not as high as with SARS-1 and MERS, but so many people are getting it that you're getting a lot more deaths from this virus than you do from SARS and MERS. One of the things that's also important to think about is how this disease not just relates to mortality, but how easily it spreads. So sort of looking at both of those at the same time. So if you look at spread along the x-axis, measles is way out to the far right. It's very contagious, okay? And on the y-axis, if you have mortality or case fatality rate, measles isn't that high. Not a lot of people die from it, but because it is so infectious, it's a very important disease. Mm-hmm. This particular virus is very similar to that flu of 1918 in that it is fairly infectious. They estimate that you have like 2.5 people for every person that gets infected. They're going to infect 2 to 2.5 other people. And the case fatality rate is about 2, or some people estimate it at 2%. They're still unsure about that, but that was what the case fatality rate was for the Spanish flu of 1918 that killed 500,000 people. So if you look at those two things, that's what makes this a really potentially dangerous virus. There are some studies out of Wuhan that have looked at sort of what happens with this disease. What did they see with it? They confirmed about 60% of the cases. It got to the point there were so many cases that they couldn't test them all, so they started basing the diagnosis on X-ray diagnosis. They did find that the people who caught this disease tended to be older. There was a higher rate among the older individuals. Very small percent were children, which is good because these viruses often affect either the elderly. If they're affecting the elderly, they also affect the young. They also found that most of the cases were mild. About 80% of the cases had minimal symptoms. But the problem there is you have minimal symptoms, you're out and you're giving other people, you're spreading it. So that you have to be aware that the people with mild symptoms are dangerous in that they can spread it. So the study in Wuhan that looked at the different demographic characteristics also found a mortality rate overall of about 2.3%, and their data was reported in the middle of February of this year. They also found that the mortality increased with increasing age. For example, older people had a mortality rate of about 15%. So Wuhan's mortality data has been questioned by the World Health Organization and some other people because it's sort of unclear whether that mortality has been seen in other countries. And the World Health Organization came out with an estimate of 3.4%, and that's pretty much where they're standing right now. Other countries such as Italy, it looks like the mortality rate may be higher, but mortality rate's hard to calculate when you're in the middle of an epidemic because you're just starting to have cases. So they have, they're early in the process, so you wouldn't really expect them to have reached, an outcome yet? Or do you look at just those people that recovered and look at how long it took them to recover and then what deaths occurred during that period? So mortality is a hard thing to estimate in the middle of an epidemic. When this thing calms down, next year, they'll have better estimates of what the mortality rate is. But right now, the World Health Organization is estimating that to be about 3.4%. So when I first did this presentation, I plotted the data that's out there from the World Health Organization, and I've been updating that every day. I use two sources, the World Health Organization, but also this website called Meteor-O-World, who actually it's a nice website in that it's probably the most up-to-date, but it searches all sources, and then it provides you the source data for the information that they're adding to this. And it's tracking really well with the World Health Organization. And when you look at that data for cases worldwide, what you see is a large jump in the middle of it in the end of February. And these graphs, what I've plotted on them are the numbers of cases, the 1st of February and the 1st of March. And then the most recent one, which was earlier this morning on March 13th. But you'll see this peak, this rapid increase. And that's when China redefined their definition, when they left the having to be diagnosed based on test results to having an X-ray diagnosis. I also have been keeping track of the deaths that have occurred worldwide. And again, I show the numbers February 1st and March 1st and the most recent. And also the number of countries, which was kind of flat for a while, but has now really taken off. And there's about 170 countries that have reported cases. So then I started adding the plots for the United States. At the time, the beginning of last week, there weren't really enough cases in the US to make worth making a plot. And now we're at over 1,000 cases. So I have the number of cases plotted by day of the month for the month of March. And what I'm waiting for, that right now the cases are going straight up every day. And in the morning, if I look at the data, there's a little, looks like it started flattening out, which is what we want, right? You want it to slow down. And by the afternoon, it's straight back up again. So when it starts flattening out, you'll know that we've gotten to the worst part. And right now, there's no flattening out. So I'll continue to monitor that. And then I'm also monitoring the deaths, same thing. And the number of states, we're now up. Alaska just reported a case this morning. I think we're up to 48 states that have reported a case. And I have now added a graph for South Dakota, just to track those cases. Then there's a wide variety of maps that are available online. One I particularly like is in this presentation that shows the number of cases in sort of circles on where the size of those cases. So why is this even important? If 80% of the cases are mild and everyone's probably going to at some point, years from now have been exposed to this, why should they be closing schools and doing all of this thing? I mean, again, there's no vaccine for this. No one's been exposed to it. You have to slow it down. And the way you do that is by limiting public gatherings. And you want to slow it down for a couple reasons. One is it is going to take a year to 18 months to come up with a vaccine, an approved vaccine for this disease. The other thing is if everyone gets sick at once, you have this big increase, and 20% of them are going to be in critical or serious condition, are going to need hospital beds. Does the country have the health care facilities to support this type of epidemic? So I just did some calculations looking at the Wuhan data. In Wuhan, about 0.7% of their population actually developed the disease. So not very much, less than 1%, but we can say 1%. South Dakota has a population of 880,000. So if 1% of the population gets this disease, it's going to be 8,800 people in South Dakota. If they get it all in a very short period of time, 20% of them are estimated to be hospitalized. Okay, that comes out to 1,700 people. South Dakota has 2,700 hospital beds. So that's like if no hospital bed had any patients. And so you're using a huge number of the hospital beds for one disease. If it's here at 1%, you're going to end up with about 1,700 people needing to be hospitalized. And you're going to end up with somewhere between 250, 300 deaths in South Dakota just from that one disease. Whether or not the hospital system can even handle that number, so what the key is, you need to spread this out. You need to slow it down so that the people who are going to become sick from this are getting sick over a longer period of time so that you don't overwhelm the system and that they can be treated appropriately medically. So what are other countries doing to slow this disease down? Probably the best example is South Korea. Wuhan kind of got into it a week or two late. If they had started some of their things earlier, it might have helped. But, they implemented, once they realized that they had this problem and they started doing things about it, when they shut the city down, the cases started leveling out and now they're actually going down. So that is what you want to happen. South Korea, they have things like drive-up testing centers, which Mayo Clinic just started one yesterday. A lot of states are now resorting to that because if you think about it, do you want a person with this virus going into a clinic, contaminating a room, and then to be tested, and then having to clean that room and everything? So what they did is, if you have the symptoms, if you have a cough, if you have a fever, you simply drive up, they register, you go to the next spot, they take your temperature, they go to the next spot, they do a nasal swab, to get tested for it, and then they send you home. You never leave your car, you don't contaminate places or other people. So great idea. And a lot of hospitals are also setting up outside screening areas so that people are not going into the hospitals. The Louvre closed. Last week they closed. A lot of the sports arenas. A lot of this happened really in Europe last week, and you're now seeing it happen here. But where they're playing the sports without spectators and just televising it. Switzerland canceled all large exhibitions. Austria now, any meeting over 100 people has been canceled in the entire country. So, why are so many people going to be affected with this disease? If you go back to the influenza of 1918, no one is immune to it. There's no vaccine. And the only way that you can control this is by quarantining cases, which they've been doing. Good personal hygiene, which I think the message is out there as far as washing your hands, staying away, like not being too close to people, probably not shaking hands. but also limiting public gatherings. You don't want a lot of people in one place at a time. You know, we had originally talked about doing this talk in front of people, and it's like not a good idea, because now you're bringing, if anyone has been exposed to this, you're putting them into a room with a lot of other people, it's going to spread. So we need to stop that. The whole message is you have to slow this down because it's going too fast. There's websites out there. SDSU has the website, and the South Dakota Department of Health has a website that provides a lot of information on what you should do, in terms of personal hygiene or how to avoid getting this disease, and what to do if you think you have it. And those symptoms are fever, cough, shortness of breath. It's those three things. And I think it's important for people to realize it isn't a hoax. It's more than the common cold, and that it will be, 12 to 18 months before there's a vaccine. So we really need to slow it down. Well, the problem with any vaccine for coronavirus is going to be like the flu, because viruses mutate very easily. So you're not going to have, the strain that's here this year may be different than what's here next year. But just like with the flu, if you get a vaccine and it's not the flu that ends up showing up during flu season, you still get some partial immunity, and the flu that you get is not as severe. So hopefully that will also happen with this particular disease. The thing about this particular disease is it's new, so no one really knows how it's going to behave. People have talked about, well, a lot of these cold viruses and the flu go down, when warm weather starts, but they don't know that. Yeah, you can say maybe this is going to happen, but they don't know it. It's a new virus. They don't know if that's actually true.